From the Lever's reader-supported newsroom, this is Lever Time. I'm Arjun Singh. During the presidential election, Democrats warned Americans that a Trump presidency would mean chaos, corruption, and the end of democracy. Well, Trump won, and barely a month and a half in, it's pure chaos. And what are the Democrats doing in response? Nobody's quite sure. Stuck in the minority, Democratic leaders in Congress have thrown up their arms, literally asking what power they have to stop Trump's agenda. And while many of them are outspoken about Trump's frightening lurch into autocracy, few are as willing to answer this question. Why did you lose? To Representative Chris Deluzio, the answer is simple. It's the economy. Hailing from Pennsylvania, which went to Trump, Deluzio beat his Republican opponent this past November, and he outran the Harris-Walz ticket. This morning, Deluzio penned an op-ed in the New York Times criticizing Democrats' response to the Trump tariffs. Instead of calling them, quote, irresponsible and unnecessary, he said, there's a chance for Democrats to get back in touch with working-class Americans. Today on Lever Time, we're going to hear from Representative Deluzio himself and his case for reforming Democrats from losers to winners. But we're also going to explore how the Democrats got here in the first place. Because to win, you've got to have a plan.
Thanks, buddy.
Thanks, I have two.
In December, Amos Barshad was reporting a story for The Lever in Millvale, Pennsylvania, which is just outside of Pittsburgh. Millvale's a small town, less than 3,500 people, and it's kind of like this little slice of Americana. As Amos told me, it's the place where you'd expect to see a Hallmark movie take place. And of course, that means at the center of action is the town's local diner.
At the time, it was Christmas music was playing, and you could just tell that this is the kind of place where people that have known each other for decades are coming. You know, they're sitting down and they're just, you get that feel, oh, these people have been having that breakfast in that booth for 50 years. You know, it's like that kind of thing.
On that morning, Amos was there to meet with Representative Chris Deluzio.
Well, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for coming in.
Oh, yeah.
How long are you in town?
Just today.
Because we're going to the Water Authority, I think.
When they met, Deluzio had just won a second term in Congress. But before that, he was in the military and then was a cybersecurity expert. Deluzio's district, which includes Millvale, has been called a national bellwether. To pundits and political analysts, and yes, DC-based journalists with podcasts like me, Millvale's melting pot of working-class and college-educated voters, who are evenly split between Democrats and Republicans, has made it an especially fascinating place. Right now, perhaps most importantly, because Pennsylvania was a state that Trump swept. But Democrat Chris Deluzio was able to win a seat that the deep Triple C marked as vulnerable.
You know, I was kind of seen as someone, because of his electoral track record, that maybe is able to find success with working class voters, you know, could do well with Trump voters, or at least wouldn't completely turn them away.
The reason Deluzio thinks he won is reminiscent of James Carville's now famous slogan when he managed Bill Clinton's successful '92 campaign. It's the economy, stupid.
Look, I had a strong economic argument from when I ran 2 years ago through my first term into the campaign. The economic argument, I think, was a little less direct, top of ticket. And I think my race, other congressional Democrats who outperformed, all had strong economic populist messages. Not everybody, but a lot of them. And I think tied those issues to things happening in their districts.
According to Deluzio, Democrats need to be more forceful in tackling issues like corporate greed, something he felt they shied away from in the last election. And this was actually a pretty popular critique of Kamala Harris's presidential campaign, especially from left-leaning Democrats. Harris's economic vision lacked focus, even though inflation and the economy were something that voters consistently ranked as their biggest concern. Instead, Democrats campaigned as though Bidenomics was a popular success, and they courted Fortune 500 CEOs and crypto executives. But that messaging didn't connect with many Americans who personally felt the economy was working against them. And when Harris did try and address economic concerns, like bringing down the price of food or subsidizing home purchases, Chris Deluzio says these policies didn't assuage voters' concerns. The result was a confusing message that felt stuck between trying to please both corporate America and voters.
Voters are smart, and even if you don't think that, it is terrible politics to tell voters they're wrong. Like, you gotta make your case, be strong about it, but you got to meet voters where they are, understand what they're saying to you. And
in fact, Harris's brother-in-law, Tony West, a top advisor to her campaign, encouraged Harris to be friendlier to corporate America on the campaign trail. And where's Tony now? Back at his day job as chief legal officer at Uber. Not exactly your average working American. To a lot of progressives, Harris's pro-business plans like proposing tax cuts for the wealthy were a slap in the face. And for people who were around in the 1990s, that sting reminded them of another Democratic presidential campaign.
Today we have an historic opportunity to make welfare what it was meant to be, a second chance, not a way of life. And even though the bill has serious flaws that are unrelated to welfare reform, I believe we have a duty to seize the opportunity it gives us to end welfare as we know it.
In the 1990s, Bill Clinton reinvented the Democratic Party. And according to historian Lily Geismer, he had a major hand in changing the Democratic Party into one that was more comfortable in the C-suite than on the picket line.
Another kind of key piece of this group of Democrats is they also think that the Democratic Party has become too beholden to organized labor. So they actually are trying, both in terms of their kind of economic strategy, but also their political strategy, to move the Democratic Party away from this kind of close connection to organized labor. And you can really see the Clinton years as the kind of embodiment of a lot of these ideas.
In her book Left Behind, The Democrats' Failed Attempt to Solve Inequality, Geismer unpacks how Clinton's championing of globalization, curtailing of social services, and embrace of the tech industry fundamentally took the party in a different direction. When Clinton entered office in 1993, he continued Ronald Reagan's economic agenda, and that was to push ahead with free trade and deregulation. Neoliberalism, basically.
As we move into the era of balanced budgets and smaller government, we must work in new ways to enable people to make the most of their own lives. We are helping America's communities not with more bureaucracy, but with more opportunities.
Clinton froze unions and accelerated the globalization of supply chains. And for a while, things seemed good. Prices went down, the economy was growing, but long-term, wealth trickled upwards from the lower and middle classes to the richest Americans. It hollowed out public institutions and shrank the government's ability to effectively monitor and restrict corporate interests. And in a lot of ways, Clinton's strategy was to make the Democratic Party more palatable to Republicans who supported stuff like women's rights and affirmative action.
It's a very deliberate strategy starting especially in the late 80s, and you can really see it play out during the Clinton era of trying to target sort of moderate suburbanites in like swing areas is the future of the Democratic Party.
But to really understand Clinton, you have to know that he was a showman. On the campaign trail, Clinton was called the natural. His ease and relative charm out in public became a hallmark of his presidency. And it was even lampooned in one of my favorite Saturday Night Live sketches, where the late and great Phil Hartman portrays Clinton as he makes his way around a McDonald's, slowly eating everyone's food.
You know, we want to create a network of community development banks to lend money to small businesses like yourself. I see your boy doesn't like pickles. Nah, he hates them. You mind? Thanks a lot. Well, good luck to you. I'm going to wake up every morning thinking about you. Thank you, sir. Oops, forgot one.
If you were a liberal in the 1990s, Clinton's presidency was paradoxical. Clinton's charisma made us feel like he was following in the footsteps of people like Lyndon B. Johnson, but he was really embracing free markets and deregulation.
Populism works, but I always say like it has to come from an actual populist. You need someone who can actually authentically sell that message. And I think that having those kinds of candidates is a potential. And I think it's one that can unify a lot of different kinds of people.
J.D. Vance considers himself a populist. So does Donald Trump. But the politician who is perhaps best associated with American-style Jeffersonian populism isn't a Republican or a Democrat. He's an independent.
But when we talk about oligarchy and what's going on in this country, it's not just that the rich are getting richer while working families struggle. Oligarchy is about political power.
Sanders believes that one of the fundamental flaws in American society is that the economy is egregiously slanted towards the wealthy at the cost of everyone else. Trump also considers himself a populist crusader.
They are coming after me because I am fighting for you, and we are fighting for those who have no voice, and we will win because we know how to win.
3 months after their initial conversation in the Millvale diner, Amos called up Deluzio to ask if the Democrats had been taking any of these lessons to heart.
Back to kind of messaging for the Democrats overall. Last month, the House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries said of the Democrats,
"What leverage do we have? They control the House, the Senate, and the presidency. It's their government."
And, a lot of people, I think, found that to be, disappointing, infuriating. And I'm just curious, when you heard that, what was your response? What was your kind of gut reaction?
I kind of have two thoughts. And one is, it is absolutely the case that Republicans are in control of this government. And that when there's any talk of, there might be a government shutdown, which would hurt a lot of people, the only people who are responsible for that would be Donald Trump and the Republicans. They do control the House, the Senate, and the White House. But that fact is no excuse for Democrats to not be standing ground as firm as we can, where we can, and using our power to protect our constituents, to protect the American people. I think people expect us to fight where we can. And we're not going to win everything, but we should absolutely use the tools at our disposal to limit the harm that this guy and his team might cause, and to find the places where we do have some leverage and things to say, even in the minority. Certainly the Republicans are, I think, careening this country toward a government shutdown. And as always, I think House Democrats will be responsible, and we'll do what we can to protect our government, to protect the American people. But I think in no case where our votes are needed in any piece of this in the minority, should Democrats be compromising on core values? Should we be willing to let our people be hurt? If Republicans can't do their own job of governing and need our support, well, they're going to have to come negotiate with us, and we're going to use that to protect our government, to protect our people, and frankly, stand up for our core values.
Today, the tension at the center of the Democrats' lofty ideals for economic and social reform are billionaires. A specific handful of billionaires now control as much wealth as a small nation. We all know about Musk, but in politics, there's billionaires everywhere. There's Reid Hoffman, the LinkedIn founder, who bankrolled super PACs for Harris. Or Mark Cuban, the affable Shark Tank host who was once the main owner of the Dallas Mavericks. And if you want to participate in either political party, you're probably going to have to cozy up to a billionaire at some point or another. So all of this led me to ask Representative Deluzio, are there actually any good billionaires?
I think the problem is less like one person or the other, and the fact that having such wealth buys you influence anywhere in politics. I think that's fundamentally the problem. Like, let's get rid of the Citizens United decision. Let's get this money out of our politics. And I don't really care how people with 3 commas in their net worth weigh into our politics any more than I care about somebody who works every day, 9 to 5, busting their butt, hoping to have a good retirement. That's American democracy to me. And I think the problem, again, is not any one personality who's incredibly wealthy and what they want to fund. The problem is that their willingness to buy commercials in our politics can fundamentally change our politics. I think it is rife with corruption. It is counter to the idea that we get to govern ourselves and everyone has a say in our democracy. And I just think unless we change how we fund elections and the power of money in our politics, we're not going to fundamentally fix this trust in our democracy.
Deluzio is optimistic, but not everyone thinks that the Democrats have what it takes to really challenge the billionaire class. We'll talk about that after the break. We'll be right back. Last month, the Democrats elected a new party chair, a guy named Ken Martin. Martin was previously the chair of the Minnesota Democratic Party, and here he is at his victory speech the night of his election.
We have one fight. We have one fight. The fight's not in here. The fight's out there, right? The fight's not in here. The fight is for our values. The fight is for working people. The fight right now is against Donald Trump and the billionaires who bought this country. That's the fight, not in here. I want to thank all of you.
Martin was asking Democrats to put aside their internal disagreements and unify around a common enemy. It was certainly a statement fitting for the time, but it was kind of an odd thing for the DNC chair to say. Putting aside the hundreds of millions of dollars that billionaires invested in Democratic super PACs, or that Joe Biden had given a billionaire a Medal of Freedom in January, that must have been an awkward thing for Martin to say, considering that just over the summer, billionaire and Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker was bragging on stage about being a billionaire at the Democratic National Convention.
Donald Trump thinks that we should trust him on the economy because he claims to be very rich. But take it from an actual billionaire.
To me, it doesn't feel like these two things are compatible. In the last election, billionaires successfully influenced the Harris campaign to adopt a more crypto-friendly posture, and the possible firing of some regulatory officials. And that reminded me of what Lily Geismer was saying, that it would take an authentic feeling populist to really change the course of Democratic politics. That's left some wondering if the Democratic Party is even an effective tool to fight for economic fairness, and especially to check the influence of billionaires. One poll released this week by a Democratic strategy firm found that only 10% of Democrats thought the party had a viable strategy to deal with Trump. And that's what led me to talking to Brianna Joy Gray. Gray's currently the host of the podcast Bad Faith, and was a former national press secretary for Bernie Sanders during his 2020 presidential campaign. In 2024, Gray was an outspoken critic of the Biden and Harris campaigns, and Democrats at large. So I was curious to hear from her. Does she think that Democrats like Chris Deluzio can regain credibility the party has lost if the party continues to be friendly with billionaires? There's this idea that we talked to Congressman Chris Deluzio about earlier, that Democrats, they didn't run on the economic issues. And I think with Harris, that was particularly true. And clearly with Biden, he was able to communicate much of what his administration was doing. But I sometimes feel that while that is certainly a true thing that happened, there's something a little deeper here, which is that say the Democrats keep putting up a Gavin Newsom or a Kamala Harris or a Joe Biden version of him, and they say all of these things, this is still the same party that, really let a lot of people down. And I guess, do they have credibility anymore? Is it just as simple as saying, if they go out and say, we're going to be in favor of a wealth tax, or we hate the corporations and whatnot, do they have that credibility to them? What do you think?
I think that's a really important question. It's not just that Democrats are incompetent or impotent or inept, and that's why they're not doing what Bernie's doing. They're not doing what Bernie's doing is because they don't want to say those things, because they're not actually committed to getting corruption out of Washington. They're not committed to getting money out of politics. They benefit enormously from the system as it is. They don't want to upset their donor base. What they're upset about is that they have lost control. They are no longer the preferred donees of people like Elon Musk and Silicon Valley and the like. They're not upset about the system that enables those people to actually take control of government and determine the course of our political system. So it's not that they don't get it. They don't know what to say. They cannot say it because they are systemically set up to have different interests than someone like Bernie Sanders. And I will also note that while I think that what Bernie Sanders is doing is the right thing to do, I don't think it serves the broader interests of the left if ultimately the goal is sheep herding people back into a Democratic Party that is not going to turn around and say, Bernie Sanders saved the party, let's let Bernie Sanders and his politics rule the party. They're just going to say, thanks, good job, Bernie. Now let's go run Gavin Newsom 2028.
Yeah, and that leaves me questioning, is the party a sustainable vehicle to actually implement these economic policies or to challenge that oligarchy? And where do you stand on that?
Look, I think there was a world where it could have been. And, that's why I dedicated myself, along with so many other people who worked for the campaign and so many volunteers across the country that took their very limited time, energy, money, and and attention to try to get Bernie Sanders across the finish line in 2016 and 2020. I think that 2020 was genuinely the last off-ramp for the Democratic Party salvaging itself and gaining credibility. And frankly, they should have been grateful that Bernie Sanders came along and gave themselves an opportunity to look once again like a party that represented the interests of working class people. But as we all know, they declined that opportunity, spent more energy in derailing the Bernie movement than they seem to be putting into confronting Trump and Musk, and what I think genuinely and rightly can be described as fascism, the union between these corporations and the state. And as a consequence, it's a very dispiriting time because I don't believe, frankly, there is currently a political off-ramp. That doesn't mean there isn't an off-ramp, but it has narrowed to being exclusively, I think, in the hands of a working class movement of people who look around and understand that but for throwing our bodies on the gears and stopping production and literally stopping the ability of these billionaires to loot our government, the looting will continue. There is no mechanism in place to stop it.
You know, when I was talking to Deluzio, I asked him point blank, are there good billionaires? To me, though, the problem is, though, that people who have the means to fund all these commercials are clearly using this means to fund these commercials. And I would argue a lot of people on the Democratic bench, you know, the strategy in this election seemed to be, hey, Reid Hoffman, hey, Mark Cuban, hey, other billionaires. The name of the game is buying up ads and getting super PACs. So you're the good billionaires and they're the bad billionaires. What did you think of Deluzio's statement, though?
I mean, you've seen the new DNC strategy is going to put less emphasis on small dollar donors. Now, what does that mean? That means that the 10 or so billionaires that elect presidents. There's been a lot of coverage on how there were these 10 people that funded Donald Trump's entire campaign, less focus on Joe Biden having gotten more billionaire support than any other candidate in 2020, and I believe also in 2024. That those are the people whose agenda is going to set the national agenda. And that, of course, people who have those kinds of resources are going to use them. I've been thinking about this a lot, thinking about writing something up on this actually, but reflecting on the recent debate that happened around the word oligarch when Bernie started this tour, obviously, and then Jamel Hill, sports reporter formerly of ESPN, did the thing that many liberals do, which is to say, I don't know about that word, let's tone police it. I don't think people really get what that means. Now, I was having these flashbacks because I'm old enough to remember back during the 2020 campaign where Jason Johnson, who was an editor at The Root and an MSNBC correspondent, decided to attack Nina Turner over the use of that word at that time. And I think one aspect that gets missed is this question of, well, is it a good billionaire or is it a bad billionaire? Jason Johnson was making the case, well, not all billionaires are bad. Oligarchs are billionaires in Russia, not the kind of good American, wholesome, I guess, billionaires that we have here at home. But remember what was happening at the time. Nina Turner was ringing the warning bell about what it meant for former mayor of New York, Michael Bloomberg, to be able to hop into the race at the 11th hour, completely self-funded, and get himself polling in certain states that had low cost of advertising, where you can just throw money at the problem and get enough face and name recognition that when called, enough people say, hey, yeah, at least I know who that guy is. I can consider voting for him. And you can buy your entry into a debate. You can buy your way onto a ballot, and all for what? Ultimately, he only got, a few delegates from Guam or something like that. But we saw the apotheosis of how this actually works in the 2024 election. So no, the question about whether there are good billionaires or bad billionaires is completely irrelevant. The question is, if you want to live in a system where someone, by dint of their wealth, can have complete and total control over our political system and our political outcomes.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Lever Time. This episode was produced by Natalie Bettendorf with help from Ariella Markowitz. It had editing support from Joel Warner and Lucy Dean Stockton. Our theme music was composed by Nick Campbell. We'll be back next week with another episode of Lever Time.